So, ladies and gentlemen, this week two human rights groups, Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch, released two separate reports examining the legality of strikes carried out by the United States by drones and by cruise missiles, essentially. The Amnesty International report focused on Pakistan, while the Human Rights Watch report focused on Yemen. And they found that many of the strikes most likely not only violate international law, they also, in some instances, may actually constitute war crimes. And this is a big deal that big groups like Amnesty International and human rights groups are actually doing this. We've talked about this on the show before, but these giant organizations have spent a lot of time and really detailed this is a big deal. So not only do these reports examine the legality, they also look at the consequences on the ground in these countries from our actions and our strikes. Reading from Amnesty International's report, quote, according to NGO and Pakistan government sources, the USA has launched some 330 to 374 drone strikes in Pakistan between 2004 and September 2013. And according to these sources, between 400 and 900 civilians have been killed in these attacks, and at least 600 people seriously injured. End quote. That's a lot of civilians there, people. That is a lot of civilians. I mean, just imagine for a second here how you might feel, how you might react if somewhere between 400 and 900 American civilians have been blown up from out of nowhere by some foreign government. Just imagine what that would be like, and imagine how you might react to that statistic. Let's look at a couple of the more horrific instances. First from the Amnesty report, then we'll talk about the Human Rights Watch report. From the Amnesty report, the first is actually that we're going to talk about is actually a 68-year-old grandmother named Mamana Bibi. She was picking crops in a field one day in 2012 near her home. About 100 feet away from her was one of her grandsons, who was also picking okra. About 100 feet away in another direction were three of her granddaughters, ages 8, 7, and 5. And they're picking crops in the field, and then all of a sudden, this 68-year-old grandmother was blown up by two U.S. Hellfire missiles that were launched from drones. Her 8-year-old granddaughter described it to Amnesty International as such. She said, quote, the explosion was very close to us. It was very strong. It took me into the air and pushed me onto the ground. I saw her shoes. We found her mutilated body a short time afterwards. It had been thrown quite a long distance away by the blast, and it was in pieces. We collected as many different parts from the field and wrapped them in a cloth. End quote. All of her grandchildren, including that one, were all injured by the shrapnel, some more severely. A few minutes later, after their grandmother was murdered, more missiles were launched, and they nearly killed two more of her grandsons. There was no one else killed, luckily, other than the 68-year-old grandmother. A lot of the children were wounded, as we said. But seriously, you're going to tell me that this 68-year-old grandmother was an imminent threat to the United States of America? Really, we're going to say that? We're going to say that this grandmother picking crops is a threat to the United States? Let's discuss another instance, shall we? This again is from Amnesty International, quote, in July 2012, two drone strikes in quick succession killed 18 laborers, including at least one boy in the Zawi Sidgi village. At least 22 villagers sustained injuries from the strikes, including an 8-year-old girl. Missiles first struck a tent in which men had gathered for an evening meal, killing 8 people. Villagers then rushed to the tent to search for survivors. They carried stretchers, blankets, and water. Then a few minutes later, the drones fired another set of missiles. Witnesses described the macabre scene of body parts and blood, panic and terror as U.S. drones continued to hover overhead, end quote. Again, that's from Amnesty International's report on drones in Pakistan. They call this, double tapping. It's so ridiculously and unbelievably evil that you'd send another set of missiles, another strike to kill people who were trying to help the wounded. There really is nothing more evil than that. One survivor of the second one we talked about said, quote, "It was a very bad situation. Some people lost their hands. Others had their heads cut off. Some lost their legs. Human body parts were scattered everywhere on the ground. The bodies were burnt, and it was not possible to recognize them," end quote. Let's go to the other report now, the one from Human Rights Watch. This is from their report. Reading again, quote, "Their report examines 6 U.S. targeted killings in Yemen, one from 2009, the rest from 2012 and 2013. 2 of the attacks killed civilians indiscriminately in clear violation of the laws of war. The others may have targeted people who were not legitimate military objectives or caused disproportionate civilian deaths," end quote. Let's look at one of the strikes that they talk about. It was a passenger van of civilians who was returning from a trip to a nearby market when it was blown up. Reading from the report, quote, "Villagers who rushed to the scene found their relatives' charred bodies dusted in flour and sugar that they were bringing home from a nearby market. The reported target of the strike, an alleged local Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula leader, was nowhere near the vehicle. One said, quote, "The bodies were charred like coal. I could not recognize the faces." He told Human Rights Watch that when he moved in closer, he realized that 3 of the bodies, including those of a woman with a young girl still in her lap, were his father, mother, and 10-year-old sister, end quote. I don't really know what to say to this. There's more instances in these reports. You get the point, though. You get the point, right? And again, these are just from reports that focus on a very small percentage of the strikes that we carry out, that our government carries out all the time here. One of the problems, other than the obvious indiscriminate death of civilians, one of the problems that both of the reports discuss is not only are these strikes, in my opinion, clearly immoral and illegal, but they're also being conducted in secrecy. And the supposed legal justification of them by our government is also, again, a secret. Secret wars, or as Jeremy Scahill writes about in his book and his film, Dirty Wars. And even with the secrecy surrounding the justification, reading again from the Human Rights Watch report, quote, "The 6 strikes did not meet U.S. policy guidelines for targeted killings that Obama disclosed in May 2013. Obama said the U.S. conducts strikes only against individuals who pose a, quote, imminent threat to the American people, when there is a near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured, and when capture is not feasible. The strikes investigated by Human Rights Watch predate Obama's disclosure of the policy guidelines, but the White House has said the rules were either already in place or being transitioned into place," end quote. Amnesty said something similar about this. They said, quote, "We cannot find any justification for these killings. There are genuine threats to the USA and its allies in the region, and drone strikes may be lawful in some circumstances. It is hard to believe that a group of laborers or an elderly woman surrounded by her grandchildren were endangering anyone at all, let alone posing an imminent threat to the United States," end quote. So look, again, not only are these strikes carried out in secret, under secret law, even after they're done, the United States government doesn't disclose information on what happened there, or why it happened there. Both of these groups called on Obama and the government and Congress not only to investigate these violations, these clear violations of international law, these most likely war crimes, but to provide a full legal rationale for targeted killings in Pakistan, in Yemen, and elsewhere, because this is happening elsewhere as well. So how did the White House respond to these reports? Well, about what you think they did. White House spokesman Jay Carney said, quote, "To the extent these reports claim that the U.S. has acted contrary to international law, we would strongly disagree. The administration has repeatedly emphasized the extraordinary care that we take to make sure counterterrorism actions are in accordance with all applicable law," end quote. But we won't tell you what the law is. We won't tell you what that law actually is. We won't tell you our interpretations of that law. But trust us, when we blow up a 68-year-old grandmother, it is 100% legal. Don't you worry. That dead grandma was killed legally. Those laborers were killed legally. It's all legal. It's not a war crime when we kill these civilians. It's legal. Totally legal. It's important. It's important, again, I want to stress, to not really get too hung up on just the drones themselves. I mean, they're bad, they're horrible, but some of these strikes weren't drones. Some of them were cruise missiles launched. But let's get to the bigger question on this. Does our government really believe that legally, that they can blow up anyone that they want to, anywhere that they want to? I mean, these reports focus on Pakistan and Yemen, two countries that we, again, are not at war with. We are not at war with either of those countries. We're also not at war with France. Could we use a drone or a missile to blow up someone in Paris if we thought that person was a terrorist? Maybe there's some dangerous 68-year-old grandmother in Le Mans who's just asking for it, right? It then also begs the question, if our government thinks they can blow up anyone anywhere, which apparently they do, does our government think it can blow up somebody here in the United States? And look, I know that's unlikely, and I can already hear a bunch of Obama's defenders, laughing and going, ah ha ha, like Obama's really gonna blow you up while you're sitting at a cafe. Ha ha ha, you are so silly. Do I really think that Obama is gonna blow up people with a drone in the United States of America? Do I really think that? No. But what I wonder is, do they think that they legally can do it? Because honestly, I don't see the legal distinction here. I don't. I think if they think that these people are a threat in Yemen, they'd be a threat in Paris, and they'd be a threat in Montana or wherever. But let's get back to the reports here. If you have time, you should check them out, because they're really heartbreaking, and they show the consequences of our actions. They really do put a tragic human face to our foreign policy. But the question I want to get to is that if we really are afraid of terrorists, if we really think that terrorists and terrorism are the major threat to our country's security, these reports do show that blowing up grandmothers and blowing up children and blowing up people who come to help the wounded are a very, very quick way of radicalizing people against us. We'll be right back.